I found out that Maple Grove HOA was building 96 luxury homes on my family's inherited farmland. But when I looked at my grandfather's old property records, I realized that the land still legally belonged to me. You should have seen their faces when I revealed my trap at their own community meeting. I never thought I'd have to fight for something that was already mine. Last March, my grandfather, Henry Carter, passed away. That's when I inherited his 200-acre farm outside of Meadow Creek. The land had been in our family for generations. But I lived far away in the city. My job kept me too busy, and I didn't visit as often as I should have. Then early one Tuesday morning, my phone rang. It was Mrs. Lewis, my grandfather's neighbor for 40 years. "They're building houses on your land," she said, her voice full of panic. "Big machines started digging yesterday. You need to come fast." At first, I thought she was mistaken. Maybe. The construction workers crossed a boundary by accident. But Mrs. Lewis wasn't the type to exaggerate things. "They put up signs everywhere," she insisted. "They're planning almost 100 houses on your east fields." I grabbed a suitcase, threw in some clothes, and jumped in my car. I drove straight to Meadow Creek, breaking speed limits the whole way. 5 hours later, I turned onto the dirt road leading to my grandfather's farmhouse. The familiar path felt different now. The peaceful countryside was filled with the sound of heavy machinery. As I reached the top of the hill, I saw something that made my heart sink. A fleet of bulldozers and excavators was tearing into the soil where my grandfather used to grow corn and soybeans. Workers in hard hats walked around, marking different areas with bright orange spray paint. Near the road, a huge sign stood tall. Future home of Maple Grove East. 96 luxury homes, starting at $450,000. I parked my car and walked toward a woman standing apart from the workers. She wore spotless beige pants and a crisp white blouse, looking completely out of place in the dusty construction zone. Her hair was perfectly styled, and she held a clipboard while talking on her phone. I waited until she finished her call. "Excuse me," I said. "What's happening here?" She looked me up and down like I was a door-to-door salesman wasting her time. "We're preparing for a residential development," she said in a smooth, practiced voice. "Martha Robinson, president of Maple Grove HOA. She extended her hand, but I ignored it. "This is my land," I told her. "My grandfather, Henry Carter, owned this farm. He passed away recently, and I inherited it." Martha's smile didn't reach her eyes. "There must be some misunderstanding," she said calmly. "Maple Grove HOA purchased this land last year. We have all the necessary permits and approvals." "That's impossible," I said. "My grandfather would never sell this farm." Martha gave me a fake, sympathetic look. "Perhaps he didn't tell you?" she said. "The sale was finalized 9 months ago. We've been planning this expansion for years." My mind started racing. Grandpa had been sick in his final months, but he was still sharp-minded. He wouldn't sell our family farm without telling me. Something wasn't right. "I need to see those documents," I demanded. She reached into her clipboard, folder, and handed me a business card. "You're welcome to contact our legal department," she said with a forced smile. "But I assure you, everything is in order. Now, if you'll excuse me, we have a schedule to maintain." She turned away and dialed another number on her phone, already ignoring me. I stood there, feeling helpless, as the machines kept tearing apart the soil that had fed my family for generations. Back at the farmhouse, Mrs. Lewis was waiting on the porch with a glass of iced tea and a worried look on her face. "They started showing up with measuring tools about 3 months ago," she told me. "Your grandpa was furious. He kept saying they had no right to be here, that they were trying to steal what wasn't theirs." "Did he ever mention selling the land?" I asked. "Never," she said firmly. "Henry swore this farm would stay in your family forever." Her eyes watered as she continued. "The day before he went to the hospital for the last time, he was looking through his old office. Said he needed to find something important to protect the farm." I swallowed hard. My grandfather's office had been untouched since his death. I hadn't had the heart to go through his things when I visited for the funeral. But now, I needed answers. I stepped inside the small, dusty office. The air smelled like old books and pipe tobacco. Shelves lined the walls, packed with family photo albums, farming almanacs, and decades of careful records. Grandpa tracked everything: rainfall amounts, crop yields, equipment repairs, all written in his neat handwriting. Where would he have kept property records? I started with the filing cabinet. The top drawer was filled with folders organized by year: but there was nothing about land sales or Maple Grove HOA. I searched for hours. Night fell, and my eyes burned from reading faded old documents. Just as I was about to give up, I noticed something. A loose floorboard under the desk. I pressed it with my foot. It moved slightly. I knelt down and pried it open with a letter opener. Inside the small hidden space, I found a metal box. A key was hanging from a nail under the desk. I unlocked the box. Inside, I found the deed to the farm, my grandfather's will, naming me as his heir, several yellowed property surveys, and at the very bottom, I found something that made my heart pound, a letter addressed to me in Grandpa's handwriting. I unfolded the letter. If you're reading this, it means someone is trying to take what's ours. My hands shook as I read his words. Grandpa explained everything. For years, developers had been trying to buy his land. They offered big money, but he always refused. In his final months, someone from Maple Grove HOA kept visiting him. They tricked him, bringing different legal papers each time, asking for a small signature for a road easement. I never signed away my land, Grandpa wrote. If they say I did, it's a lie. Check the original survey from 1910. Compare it to the county records. The truth is in the boundaries. I dug deeper into the box. I found the original 1910 survey. My jaw dropped. The property lines extended much further than I thought. According to this document, Grandpa's farm was nearly 280 acres, not the 200 acres listed in the current records. Something shady had happened. That night, I spread out the papers across the kitchen table, comparing the old surveys with newer maps. Something was wrong. Over the decades, the eastern boundary had been shifted, shrinking our land. And it wasn't just the area under construction. According to these original documents, part of Maple Grove's existing neighborhood, the clubhouse and 20 homes, were sitting on my land. I didn't sleep that night. By dawn, I knew exactly what I had to do. First, I needed a lawyer. Then, I needed to figure out exactly what Maple Grove HOA was up to. If they thought they could steal from my family, they were about to learn a painful lesson. I folded Grandpa's letter and slipped it into my pocket. I won't let you down, I whispered. Little did Martha Robinson know, she hadn't just messed with a grieving grandchild. She had walked straight into a trap my grandfather had set years ago. I didn't sleep that night. By 8 a.m., I was waiting outside the office of Mark Henderson, the only property lawyer in Meadow Creek. His secretary looked surprised when I asked for an emergency appointment, but she managed to squeeze me in before lunch. Mark was older than I expected. He wore thick glasses and a bow tie that made him look like he was from another era. He listened carefully as I explained my situation. Then I spread out the documents on his desk. These are the original land surveys from 1910, updated in 1978, I said. Compare them to the current county records. Mark traced the boundary lines with his finger. His eyebrows rose higher and higher as he examined the papers. This is highly unusual, he finally said. According to these original documents, your property extends nearly half a mile further east than what's currently recorded. I already knew what that meant. That includes not just the construction site, I said, but also the existing Maple Grove clubhouse and about 20 homes built 5 years ago. Mark removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes. A boundary dispute of this size won't be simple, he said. We need to understand how and when these changes happened. He called the county assessor's office and put the call on speaker. We were transferred through multiple departments before we found what we were looking for. And what we discovered was shocking. In 1984, a minor adjustment was recorded, a 10-foot easement for utility lines. That wasn't a big deal. But in 1997, there was a much bigger change. The records showed that the eastern boundary had been moved, reducing the property by nearly 80 acres. There was barely any documentation about this change, just a form with a signature. I stared at the date. That's the month my grandfather was in the hospital, I said. Triple bypass surgery. He couldn't have signed this. Mark's expression turned serious. That would constitute fraud, he said. But proving it after all these years won't be easy. What can we do? I asked. First, we file for an emergency injunction to stop construction immediately, Mark said. Then, we petition the court to recognize the original property boundaries based on the historic surveys. We'll need a professional surveyor to verify these maps. As Mark prepared the legal filing, I realized I needed more ammunition. So I drove straight to the county records office. The records office was huge and outdated. I spent hours digging through old files, flipping through stacks of public records, and then, in a dusty back corner of the archives, I found something golden. Maple Grove wasn't just a neighborhood. It was a complicated web of LLCs and holding companies, and the same 6 names kept appearing. Martha Robinson, president of Maple Grove HOA, Daniel Robinson, her husband, James Harris, county commissioner Mark Wilson, planning board director. 2 other names I didn't recognize, but the most important document was from just 3 months ago, a loan approval for $16 million. It was financing the new Maple Grove expansion. And what was listed as collateral for the loan? My land. I took photos of everything with my phone. Then, I drove to my next stop, the local newspaper. At the Meadow Creek Gazette, I met with Tanya Williams, the editor. She had known my grandfather. When I told her I was investigating possible fraud involving powerful local officials, she immediately sat up straight. "I can't publish accusations without proof," she warned, "but I can look into how this development got approved." I remember thinking it moved unusually fast. I thanked her and left. Back at the farmhouse, I found Mrs. Lewis talking to another, elderly neighbor. "Mr. Grayson," she introduced him. When I mentioned Martha Robinson, his face darkened. "That woman is the reason I sold my house," he said bitterly. "The HOA fined me every week for unapproved landscaping. I'd been growing tomatoes for 20 years. Then they said my workshop violated some rule they just made up." "What happened?" I asked. "The fines kept coming until I couldn't afford to fight anymore," he said. I frowned. "How many others did this happen to?" "At least a dozen," he said. "Old-timers. We all sold for less than market value." Later, I found out those buyers were connected to Maple Grove HOA. A pattern was emerging. They found vulnerable homeowners, hit them with harassment and fines, forced them to sell cheap, and then developed the land for millions. My grandfather had been their latest target, but he had been one step ahead of them. My phone rang. It was Mark Henderson. "The judge granted our emergency injunction," he said. "Construction has to stop immediately until the hearing next week." But then, he added something that made my stomach drop. "Brace yourself," he warned. "This is going to get ugly." I thanked him and hung up. For the first time, I felt a small victory. I drove back to the construction site, the court order in hand. The workers were packing up for the day when I arrived. Martha Robinson's sleek black SUV was still parked near the site office. She came out as I approached, phone in hand as usual. When she saw me, her expression hardened. I held up the court order. "Construction stops now," I said. "Legal boundaries are in dispute." She snatched the document from my hand. Her perfect composure cracked slightly as she read it. "This is ridiculous," she said. "We have every approval we need." "Based on fraudulent boundaries," I said. "I have the original surveys." For the first time, I saw uncertainty flash in her eyes. It vanished quickly, replaced by cold determination. "This little stunt will cost you," she said quietly. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." I smiled. "Actually, I do," I said. 6 names on dozens of business filings, $16 million in loans using stolen land as collateral. County officials, fast-tracking approvals for projects they secretly invest in. I hadn't planned to reveal everything yet, but the look on her face was worth it. Her hand tightened around her phone until her knuckles turned white. "You're making a mistake," she hissed. "We can be reasonable. Perhaps you'd consider a generous offer for the remaining farmland." "7 figures? Immediate payment?" "Not interested." Her fake smile returned. "Everyone has a price." I shook my head. "This land has been in my family for 4 generations. It's not for sale." I turned to leave, feeling her eyes burning into my back. Just as I reached my car, she called out, "Commissioner Harris is my husband's golf partner. Judge Evans comes to my dinner parties. You think your injunction will last? You're nobody in this town." I drove away, her words echoing in my mind. She was right about one thing. I was an outsider here now, but she had overlooked something important. My grandfather hadn't been, and he had left me more than just land. Back at the farmhouse, I returned to Grandpa's office. If Grandpa had anticipated this fight, what else had he prepared? I searched more carefully, examining every folder, every notebook, and even an album labeled Community Picnic 2018. Inside, I found dozens of photos of Grandpa with neighbors, local business owners, and families who'd known him forever. Each photo had names written on the back. These weren't just memories, they were connections. People who might stand with me against Maple Grove HOA. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Parking violation at your property. Fine, $500. Maple Grove HOA compliance. Attached was a photo of my car parked at Grandpa's farm, my own property. This was how it started. The pattern Mr. Grayson had described. Harassment by paperwork. But unlike the others, I now knew their game, and I had something they didn't expect. Grandpa's secret weapon, still hidden in his files, was waiting for the right moment. As night fell over the farm, I sat on the porch where Grandpa used to tell me stories during summer visits. The eastern fields lay quiet, with construction equipment abandoned under the court order. But this was just the beginning. Tomorrow, I knew Martha would mobilize her connections. The real fight was coming. What she didn't realize was that I had found more than just property surveys in Grandpa's hidden box. I had found documents that not only questioned the boundary changes, but also revealed who had falsified them, when, and why. Martha thought she was dealing with an absent grandchild fighting for sentimental land, but she had no idea she was facing the ghost of my grandfather, who had documented every dirty deal and suspicious approval for years. He had been patiently building a case while they thought he was just a stubborn old farmer. The trap was set. All I had to do was let them walk further into it. I pushed open the glass doors of the Maple Grove Community Center. Tonight was the night I'd been planning for weeks. Inside, nearly 100 people filled rows of folding chairs, chatting excitedly about new tennis courts and fancy streets. They sipped punch from small plastic cups. At the front, Martha Robinson stood tall in a bright red blazer, pointing at colorful pictures of big houses on a screen. "Just imagine the swimming pool with its waterfall feature," she said, smiling wide at the crowd. "Our homes will be worth so much more once these new neighbors move in." People clapped. Some even whistled. But nobody knew what I carried in my folder. That would ruin their party. I took a deep breath and walked straight down the center aisle. "Excuse me," I said loud enough to make heads turn. "I need to speak about this development." Martha's smile dropped for a second, then returned, faker than before. "We'll take questions after the presentation," she said, trying to shut me down. "This can't wait," I replied, stepping onto the small stage. I faced the curious crowd. "My name is Alex Morgan. My grandfather owned Willow Creek Farm for 60 years, the old property we purchased." Martha cut in quickly. "Yes, we're very grateful to finally develop that eyesore," she said. Murmurs rippled through the room. I opened my folder and pulled out the first document. "This is the original land survey from 1910, I said, holding it up. "And this is the updated survey from 1978. I held up another paper. "According to these legal documents, my grandfather's land extends 80 acres further east than what appears in current county records." I turned to face the HOA board members seated in a row behind the podium. I placed copies of the documents in front of each of them. "Put simply," I continued, "you're building on land that legally belongs to me, and not just the new development. According to these boundaries, 20 existing homes in your clubhouse are sitting on my property too." The room exploded with voices. People stood up. Someone knocked over a chair. "This is ridiculous," Martha shouted, grabbing one of the surveys. "We have permits. We've sold lots. Construction has already started." I stayed calm while she grew redder. "Your permits are based on incorrect property lines," I said. "I filed papers with the court to stop all building immediately." Gerald Fisher, a balding man with thick glasses who served as the HOA treasurer, studied the documents with growing panic. "Martha," he whispered loudly enough for the microphone to catch. "These boundary markers match the old creek bed. They look real." She yanked the papers out of his hands. "This is clearly some kind of trick to get money from us," she snapped. "We'll fight this nonsense." I wasn't worried. "You're welcome to try," I replied, pulling out one final document. "But here's something you should know. According to these legal boundaries, your personal house, Martha, sits entirely on what is legally my land." The room went completely quiet. People looked at each other, suddenly understanding what this meant. Families might not actually own the ground under their homes. A man in the back stood up. "Are you saying we might lose our houses?" Before I could answer, Martha slammed her hand on the podium. This meeting is over. Everyone out. The board needs to discuss this privately. As people shuffled out, whispering nervously, a younger woman touched my arm. I'm Rachel Winters. I just put my life savings into a lot in the news section. What happens to me? I hadn't expected to face the human cost so directly. I'm not trying to hurt regular people, I told her honestly. This is about fixing a wrong. Don't listen to a word she says, Martha hissed suddenly, stepping up beside us after everyone else left. She leaned in close, her voice low and threatening. You have no idea who you're messing with, she said, her eyes narrowing. I built Maple Grove from nothing. Nobody takes it from me. Her threat hung in the air between us as she stormed off, leaving me alone in the empty room. Through the windows, I could see groups of worried homeowners gathering in the parking lot. My phone buzzed with a text from Mark Henderson. How did it go? He asked. I typed back. They know now. Get ready for their next move. But what I didn't tell him was how shaken I felt. I had lit the fuse, but I wasn't sure if I was fully prepared for the explosion that would follow. These weren't just paper houses on a map. They were real people's homes and dreams. But they had built those dreams on my grandfather's stolen land. Someone would end up losing everything, and Martha Robinson wasn't going to go down without a fight. I jerked awake to the sound of engines outside my grandfather's farmhouse. Bright lights flooded through the windows. I stumbled to the porch to find 3 white SUVs with Maple Grove security painted on their doors, blocking my driveway. Men in uniform stood by the vehicles. One stepped forward, handing me a thick envelope. Cease and desist notice from the Maple Grove Homeowners Association, he said flatly. You are ordered to withdraw all claims against the development or face legal action. I tore open the envelope. Inside was a letter claiming that my documents were fake and accusing me of fraud. They demanded I pay for damages to the community's reputation. You can't be serious, I said. The man shrugged. Just delivering the message, he said. Have a nice day. But none of them left. I tried to leave for breakfast in town, but I discovered they had placed large concrete blocks across the end of my driveway overnight. Sorry, sir, one guard said without looking sorry at all. This access point hasn't been approved by the development committee. It's been closed for safety reasons. I was trapped on my own property. I called the sheriff's office, but they told me they couldn't help with a civil dispute and suggested I get a lawyer. My phone rang. It was Martha. Good morning, she said sweetly when I answered. Enjoying the view? I was furious. This is harassment, I said. You can't block access to my property. Actually, she laughed, according to county records, that driveway crosses Maple Grove's common areas. We're within our rights to control access. I felt my stomach drop as she continued. You know those records are wrong, I said. She laughed again, her voice dripping with confidence. Let me explain how this works, she said. The county commissioner plays golf with my husband every Sunday. The building inspector's daughter works for my real estate company. The water department supervisor lives in Maple Grove. My stomach churned. She wasn't finished. By tomorrow, your farmhouse will be cited for at least 15 code violations. Your water might get shut off due to maintenance issues. Local contractors won't return your calls because they know better than to cross me. That's illegal, I said. That's small-town politics, she replied coldly. You can't win this, but I'm reasonable. Drop your claims, sign over the CI. Disputed acres, and this all goes away. I'll even throw in a nice payment for your trouble. This isn't about money, I told her. It's always about money, dear, she said. Think it over. You have until tomorrow. She hung up. I stared at my phone, then at the security vehicle still parked outside. They weren't leaving. True to Martha's word, by the afternoon, a county inspector arrived to examine the farmhouse. He found problems with everything: the wiring, the septic system, the porch railings. He handed me a list of violations that would cost thousands to fix, all needed immediately. As the inspector left, another truck arrived. The workers put up signs along my property line. Future home of Maple Grove East. Luxury living coming soon. My water pressure dropped to a trickle. I called the utility company, but they claimed there was maintenance work happening and couldn't say when it would be fixed. I tried ordering pizza for dinner, but the delivery driver called to say he couldn't find my address. Though delivery had never been a problem before, I was being cut off, step by step. That night, I sat on the porch in the darkness, watching the security lights sweeping across the fields where my grandfather had once grown corn. The bulldozers sat silent in the distance, waiting to continue destroying his legacy. My phone lit up with a message from Mark Henderson. "They've filed a countersuit claiming your documents are forged. Court date is set for 3 months from now. They'll keep building in the meantime." 3 months. By then, the houses would be half finished, and the damage would be done. I scrolled through my contacts, looking for anyone who might help. A name caught my eye: Janet Rivera, a reporter for the local newspaper. We'd gone to high school together. I hadn't spoken to her in years, but maybe I considered calling her when I saw headlights appear on the long driveway. The car maneuvered around the concrete barriers and pulled up to the house. I tensed, wondering what new trouble Martha was sending my way. The car parked, and Gerald Fisher, the HOA treasurer who had examined my documents at the meeting, stepped out. "I shouldn't be here," he said nervously, glancing back at the security vehicles in the distance. "Why are you here?" I asked. He pulled out a flash drive from his pocket. "Because what Martha is doing isn't right. I've been keeping the HOA books for 7 years. There are things you need to see." I invited him inside, away from the watching eyes of the security. We sat down at the kitchen table. Gerald opened his laptop and showed me financial records, meeting minutes, and emails. "Martha and the board have been using HOA funds like their personal bank account," he explained. "Special fees disappear. Contracts go to family members. Reserve funds get invested in businesses." "Why show me this?" I asked. "Because I'm not the only unhappy homeowner," he said. "A lot of us are tired of her rules and her control. When you showed up with those property documents, it was the first time I've seen her scared." He pointed to a spreadsheet on the laptop. "Look at these special assessments from last year," he said. "Every homeowner paid $2,000 for road repairs. The actual work cost half that amount. The rest just vanished." "That's theft," I said. Gerald nodded. "And there's more. The 20 homes you said are on your land. Those people have been complaining about drainage problems for years. Martha keeps promising fixes, but nothing happens. Now we know why. She knew those houses might not legally belong to the HOA. As we talked, my phone buzzed with texts from numbers I didn't recognize. "We support you against Martha. The Millers, 42 Maple Grove Lane. She fined us $500 for planting vegetables instead of flowers. Can we help? The Jackson family. Our children's playground equipment was removed without notice. We want to join your fight. The Rodriguez family." Gerald smiled. "Slightly. I may have shared your number with a few friends," he said. "For the first time since this battle began, I felt hope. Martha had power, connections, and money, but she had also made enemies, many of them. We need a plan," I said, "and I think I know where to start." As Gerald left, carefully driving past the security vehicles, I watched a light rain begin to fall on the half-built houses in the distance. Martha thought she was punishing me into submission. Instead, she had just helped me find the allies I needed to win this war. Tomorrow would be different. Tomorrow, I would stop playing defense. My grandfather always said, "The best trap isn't one your enemy walks into. It's one they help you build without knowing it." Martha had just handed me the final pieces I needed. I stood in my grandfather's kitchen, looking at spoiled food in the warm refrigerator. Diane Reynolds thinks she can bully me off my own land by making life unbearable, I thought to myself. She had another thing coming. I grabbed my notebook and headed out. If Diane wanted war, I needed allies. The first person I visited was Mrs. Lewis, who answered her door in a flowered housecoat. "They shut off your utilities?" she gasped. "That's illegal." "So is building on my land," I replied. "But Diane has friends at the county office. I need to know who else might hate the HOA." "As much as we do." Mrs. Lewis's eyes lit up. "Oh, honey," she said. "Grab a chair, this might take a while." She gave me 15 names, families who'd been fined for the wrong color mailbox, elderly couples threatened with liens for having grandchildren visit too often, a single mom who couldn't afford the $900 fee for a small fence to keep her toddler safe. I spent the entire day knocking on doors throughout Maple Grove. At first, people were scared to talk, but when I showed them my property documents, something changed. Hope replaced fear. Sarah Jenkins, whose garden had been forcibly removed, invited me in for lemonade. "Diane made my husband dig up our tomato plants because vegetables weren't aesthetically pleasing," she said, hands shaking with anger. We got a $500 fine. My husband works 2 jobs already. The Patel family had spent $3,000 fighting the HOA over their porch swing. The Johnsons couldn't paint their front door the color they wanted. Every house looked exactly the same, beige with white trim. It's not just the rules, Trevor Martinez explained, while his wife Maria nodded. It's how they enforce them. Diane drives around taking pictures of violations. Some people get warnings, others get instant fines. There's no fairness. By sunset, I had talked to 27 families, all with similar stories, all afraid of Diane Reynolds. I picked up my phone and called Mark Henderson, my lawyer. Can we legally form a competing homeowners association? I asked. On your land? Absolutely, he replied. But what about the existing homes? That's where it gets interesting, I said. I'm going to need the community center for a meeting tomorrow night. Mark laughed. They'll never let you use it. They don't own it. I do, according to my property lines. The next day I printed 200 flyers for an emergency community meeting. The flyers read, "Your home may be at risk." I included copies of the original property survey. As darkness fell, the community center was packed. Nearly 400 people filled the room. There were existing homeowners, construction workers now without jobs, county officials, and curious locals. The air was filled with fear and anger. I took a deep breath and stepped up to the microphone. My name is Alex Morgan. This was my grandfather's land. I didn't come here looking for trouble. I came to honor his legacy. Shouts interrupted me. What? About our homes? We'll sue! My life savings is tied up in that house. I raised my hands to quiet the room. Please, I said. I'm not here to take anything from you. In fact, I want to offer a solution that benefits everyone. The room quieted slightly. First, I continued, all existing homeowners will receive proper legal deeds to their property. No one will lose their home. Murmurs of relief spread through the crowd. Second, I added, the new development will be redesigned to protect the wetlands that my grandfather cherished. These aren't just swamps. They're critical habitats and natural flood protection for the entire area. I clicked to the next slide, showing Grandpa's environmental studies. These wetlands are home to 3 endangered species. Building on them isn't just wrong. It's illegal under federal law. A man stood up. I put my life savings into a lot in the new section. What happens to my investment? Fair question, I replied. We're establishing a property exchange program. Anyone who purchased in the protected area can swap for an equivalent lot in the redesigned development. No one loses their investment. For the next hour, I outlined my vision. A community that balances homes with nature, with transparent governance, reasonable rules, and fair fees that actually went toward community improvements. Toward the end, Sarah Jenkins took the microphone. I've lived under Diane's rules for 8 years, she said. I couldn't paint my door blue. I couldn't grow tomatoes. My kids couldn't play outside after 7 p.m. because it violated the noise ordinance. She looked around the room. Is that really the community we want? By the time the meeting ended, we had over 300 signatures supporting the new Meadow Creek Community Association. Even some of Diane's former allies joined, including Gerald Fisher, who agreed to help untangle the financial mess. The next 6 months weren't easy. Diane hired expensive lawyers who tried every trick to overturn our claims, but the evidence was too strong. She eventually accepted a plea deal on the financial fraud charges. Today, 1 year later, I'm sitting on my grandfather's porch, watching kids ride bikes past houses with doors painted in every color of the rainbow. The community garden, where Sarah's tomatoes grow tall, is buzzing with neighbors sharing gardening tips. Behind me, Grandpa's farmhouse has been transformed into our community center. Classes, meetings, and celebrations happen daily. The wetlands are protected by a conservation easement, with walking trails and educational signs explaining the importance of each plant and animal. Mrs. Lewis joins me on the porch, handing me lemonade. Your grandfather would be bursting with pride, she says, pointing to where construction has finally resumed on the redesigned development. Smaller homes, more green space, solar panels on every roof. I pull out a faded notebook from Grandpa's study. I found something while cleaning out his study, I tell her. Grandpa's journal from 30 years ago. He fought the original developers back then too, when they first tried to build on the wetlands. Mrs. Lewis smiles. He always said you were just like him, stubborn as a mule when fighting for what's right. In the distance, a blue heron rises from the protected marsh, soaring above homes where people now live in harmony with the land. Sometimes the best trap isn't about catching someone doing wrong. It's about showing them a better way to do right. Diane's HOA tried to steal my land, but instead they gave me something far more valuable.